My name is Rachel Carson, and I'm 46 years old. I live alone in a small cabin on 20 acres of land in the foothills of northern Arizona, about 30 miles outside of Flagstaff. I've been here for 8 years, ever since my divorce, seeking solitude and simplicity after 20 years of suburban life that had slowly suffocated me. My property borders national forest, so wildlife is part of my daily existence. Deer grazing near my garden, coyotes calling at night, hawks circling overhead, occasionally a bear passing through. I work remotely as a freelance editor, which gives me the flexibility to live in this isolated location. My days follow a quiet rhythm, writing and editing in the morning, hiking or working in my garden, and reading by the fireplace in the evening. It's lonely sometimes, but it's the kind of loneliness I chose deliberately, trading the chaos of marriage and city life for peace and independence. I've always loved animals, had grown up with dogs and cats, volunteered at animal shelters before moving here. But living adjacent to wilderness, I've learned to respect wild animals from appropriate distance. I don't feed them or try to interact. I appreciate their presence without interfering in their lives. That philosophy worked well until late October, when an early winter storm changed everything. The weather forecast had predicted heavy rain and possible snow at higher elevation. I'd prepared appropriately, stocked firewood, checked that my generator was functional in case of power outage, filled my pantry with supplies. The storm arrived on a Thursday evening, more intense than predicted. Rain pounded against my metal roof with deafening force. Wind bent the pine trees surrounding my cabin at alarming angles. Thunder rolled continuously through the mountains. I was reading by the fire, my golden retriever Max sleeping on the rug, when I heard something unusual over the storm noise. A sound that wasn't wind or rain, something animal and distressed. Max heard it too, lifting his head, ears alert. The sound came again, closer now, a crying or yowling that suggested an animal in pain or fear. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my rain jacket, and opened the front door. The wind nearly tore it from my hands. Rain blew horizontally across my covered porch. I swept the flashlight beam across the porch and froze. Huddled against the cabin wall, soaking wet and shivering, was a bobcat. Not a domestic cat, a wild bobcat, probably weighing 35 or 40 pounds, with the distinctive spotted coat, tufted ears, and short tail that identified the species. It looked young, maybe not fully grown, and it was clearly in distress. Bobcats are normally solitary, elusive animals that avoid human contact. Seeing one this close was extremely unusual. Seeing one that didn't run when I appeared was unprecedented. The animal looked at me with eyes that reflected my flashlight, made that distressed sound again, but didn't move from its position against the wall. I stood there getting drenched, my mind racing. The bobcat was obviously in trouble, possibly injured, definitely cold and wet, seeking shelter from the brutal storm. My instinct was to help, but this was a wild predator, not a lost kitten. Bobcats have powerful jaws and sharp claws. They can be dangerous if cornered or frightened. But looking at this animal shivering against my cabin wall, I couldn't just close the door and leave it to suffer. I made a quick decision. I went back inside, grabbed several old towels and a large dog crate I'd kept from when I used to foster rescue dogs. I opened the crate on the porch, lined it with dry towels, then slowly backed away. The bobcat watched me with what seemed like cautious intelligence. After I retreated to the doorway, it limped. I noticed the limp for the first time, toward the crate, sniffed cautiously, then crawled inside onto the dry towel. I carefully closed the crate door, securing it, but ensuring the animal had ventilation. I moved the crated bobcat to my enclosed back porch, an area protected from the storm but separate from my main living space. I put down bowls of water and some raw chicken I had in my refrigerator, though I wasn't sure if the animal would eat while so stressed. Then I went back inside, locked the door between the porch and house, and tried to calm my racing heart. Max was agitated, smelling the wild animal through the door, whining and pacing. I kept him close, reassuring him while I researched what to do. I called the Arizona Game and Fish Department's emergency wildlife line, but given the storm, I only reached a recording. I left a message explaining the situation, asking for guidance. I checked on the bobcat every hour through the glass door. It had eaten the chicken and drunk water, which I took as positive signs. It lay curled in the crate, no longer shivering, occasionally opening its eyes to look at me through the glass. There was something almost trusting in those glances, though. That might have been my imagination projecting human emotions onto a wild animal. The storm raged all night. I barely slept, worried about the bobcat, worried I'd made a terrible mistake bringing a wild predator onto my property. What if it was rabid? What if it became aggressive when it recovered from whatever had weakened it? What if wildlife officials charged me with some violation for interfering with wildlife? Morning came with the storm still intense but slightly diminished. The bobcat was awake, alert, watching me through the glass. I opened the porch door slightly, spoke softly, tried to assess its condition from safe distance. It wasn't hissing or showing aggression, just watching with those intense golden eyes. The limp I'd noticed seemed to come from its right front paw, which it was favoring. Around noon, my phone finally had signal again. Game and Fish called back. The officer I spoke with, a woman named Jennifer Martinez, listened to my description, then explained several things. Officer Martinez told me that based on my description, the bobcat was probably a young male, perhaps a year old, recently pushed out of his mother's territory and struggling to establish his own reign. The injury to his paw could be from a failed hunt, a fight with another animal, or simply an accident while navigating rough terrain during the storm. Bobcats occasionally sought human shelter during extreme weather when they were injured or vulnerable, though it was rare. She asked if the animal seemed aggressive or showed signs of rabies, excessive drooling, disorientation, unprovoked aggression. I said no, just frightened and hurt. Martinez said that was good. She explained that technically I should have left the animal alone unless it was in immediate danger, but given the circumstances and the storm, she understood my decision. She advised me to keep it contained and comfortable, and she'd try to send someone to assess it once the roads were safe, probably the next day. In the meantime, I should provide water but not too much food, should avoid direct contact, and should watch for any behavioral changes that might indicate disease or increased distress. If the animal seemed to be recovering, the best outcome would be to release it back into the wild once the storm passed and its paw improved. I followed her instructions. The bobcat, I'd started thinking of him as Bob, though I knew better than to name a wild animal, stayed calm in the crate. He ate small amounts of the chicken I provided, drank water, and slept most of the day. His breathing was steady, his eyes clear. He didn't seem sick, just exhausted and hurt. By evening, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by several inches of snow at my elevation. The temperature dropped significantly. I was glad I'd brought the bobcat to the enclosed porch rather than leaving him exposed. He wouldn't have survived the night in his weakened state. I sat on the floor on my side of the glass door, watching him through the window. He watched me back. There was a moment, probably meaningless, probably just my imagination, when our eyes met and I felt a connection, an acknowledgement passing between species. This wild animal, who should have feared and avoided me, had sought my help when desperate. I'd responded with compassion rather than fear. We were unlikely allies thrown together by weather and circumstance. That night I slept better, knowing the storm had passed and the bobcat seemed stable. The next morning, Saturday, I woke to brilliant sunshine reflecting off fresh snow. The world looked pristine, beautiful, and cold. I checked on Bob immediately. He was standing in his crate, putting slight weight on his injured paw, looking stronger than he had 2 days ago. I opened the back porch door carefully. Bob's ears went forward, alert but not frightened. I'd planned to wait for Officer Martinez, but looking at this animal who clearly wanted freedom, I made a decision. I positioned the crate so its door faced the open porch exit to my yard. Then I retreated to the house and watched through the window. Bob sniffed the air coming through the open crate door. He tested his injured paw, taking a few careful steps inside the crate. Then, with a movement so quick I almost missed it, he bolted from the crate across the porch and into the snowy yard. He moved with a slight limp but surprising speed, heading toward the tree line. At the forest edge, he paused, looked back at my house for a long moment, then disappeared into the pines. I felt a surprising mix of relief and sadness. Relief that he was wild and free again, that I hadn't permanently habituated him to human presence. Sadness because, absurdly, I'd felt connected to this creature during our brief time together. I called Officer Martinez, reported that the Bobcat had been released and seemed healthy enough to survive. She said that was probably the best outcome, thanked me for helping the animal without trying to keep it. I went about my weekend, editing work, cleaning the cabin, walking Max through the snow-covered forest. I kept looking for signs of Bob, tracks in the snow or glimpses of spotted fur, but saw nothing. Wild animals are experts at staying hidden. I told myself he'd probably moved far from my property, reestablishing his territory away from the place where he'd been vulnerable. Sunday passed quietly. Monday morning, I woke early to work on a manuscript deadline. I made coffee, sat at my desk by the window overlooking the front porch, opened my laptop. Max, sleeping nearby, suddenly lifted his head and gave a low woof, not his aggressive bark, but his curious, alert sound. I looked up from my computer and saw movement on the porch. My heart jumped. Bob was back. The Bobcat sat on my porch steps, looking directly at the window where I sat. In his mouth, he carried something. As I watched, he carefully placed the object on the wooden porch boards, then sat back, looking at my door. I moved slowly to get a better view. The object Bob had brought was a rabbit, a large jackrabbit, freshly killed, still warm based on the slight steam rising from it in the cold morning air. The Bobcat sat beside his offering, watching the door, making no move to eat the rabbit himself. I stood frozen, trying to understand what I was witnessing. Animals don't think like humans, don't have our concepts of gratitude or reciprocity. And yet, this wild Bobcat had returned to the place where he'd found shelter, had brought food, the most valuable resource for a predator, and was presenting it in what seemed unmistakably like an offering. I grabbed my phone, started recording video, wanting documentation of this incredible moment. Bob sat patiently on the porch, occasionally glancing at the rabbit, then back at my door. After several minutes, when I didn't come out, he stood, looked directly at the window where I watched, then turned and limped back toward the forest, leaving the rabbit behind. I waited until he disappeared into the trees, then carefully went outside. The rabbit was definitely fresh, killed cleanly with a bite to the neck, a hunting technique Bobcats use efficiently. There was no other explanation for its presence on my porch except that Bob had brought it. I took photos, documented everything, then properly disposed of the rabbit, not wanting to create a pattern where the Bobcat expected me to accept his offerings. I called Officer Martinez again, describing what had happened. She was quiet for a long moment, then said she'd heard similar stories occasionally, wild animals showing apparent gratitude to humans who'd helped them, but it was rare, difficult to prove, and often dismissed as coincidence or anthropomorphism. However, she'd seen enough in her career to believe that animals were more intelligent and emotionally complex than we often credited. She reminded me not to encourage further interaction, to let Bob return completely to his wildlife. I agreed, but I was deeply moved by what had happened. This animal, who I'd sheltered for one night during a storm, had returned with what seemed to be his way of saying thank you, offering me food, the most valuable thing he could provide. Over the following weeks, I occasionally saw Bob at a distance. He was establishing territory that apparently included the edges of my property. I'd spot him hunting near my tree line at dusk or find his tracks in snow around my cabin. He never approached the house again, maintained appropriate wild distance, but his presence felt like a quiet, ongoing connection. I researched bobcat behavior extensively, reading wildlife biology papers, consulting with experts. The consensus was that while animals don't experience gratitude in human terms, they do understand positive and negative association. Bob associated my property with safety and survival during a desperate time. His bringing the rabbit could have been instinctive sharing behavior, similar to how cats bring prey to their kittens or sometimes to human caretakers they perceive as part of their family group. Whether it was gratitude, instinct, or something between those concepts, the meaning was the same. I had helped an animal in need, and that animal had acknowledged the help in the only way he knew how. It was a gift, a moment of connection between species that usually exist in separate worlds. My friends and family, when I told them the story, had mixed reactions. Some thought it was beautiful, proof of deeper animal intelligence and emotion. Others were skeptical, thought I was reading too much into animal behavior, projecting human feelings onto a wild predator acting on instinct. My ex-husband, when he heard the story through our mutual friends, apparently said it was typical of me to romanticize a dangerous situation, that I could have been seriously injured or infected with rabies. Maybe he was right about the danger. Maybe I had been reckless bringing a wild bobcat onto my porch. But standing in my cabin, watching Bob hunt successfully in the forest beyond my yard, seeing him strong and healthy and wild, I felt certain I'd made the right choice. Compassion sometimes requires risk. Connection sometimes requires vulnerability. The story spread through my small community and eventually reached local media. A reporter from the Flagstaff newspaper wanted to write a feature about wildlife encounters and human kindness. I initially declined, not wanting attention, but Officer Martinez encouraged me to share the story. She said it could help educate people about appropriate wildlife interaction, how to help animals in genuine distress while still maintaining the boundaries that keep both humans and wildlife safe. The article ran with photos I'd taken of Bob on my porch with the rabbit, and the response was overwhelming. People shared their own stories of unlikely animal encounters, of moments where the line between human and wild seemed to blur. Wildlife rehabilitation centers contacted me, said the story highlighted the kind of careful, respectful intervention they tried to teach, helping when necessary, but always with the goal of returning animals to their natural independence. Bob remained a presence on my property through the winter and into spring. I never fed him or tried to interact with him directly, but I'd see him occasionally, and there was a quality to those sightings that felt different from seeing other wildlife. When deer or coyotes appeared on my land, they were wary, saw me as potential threat. When Bob appeared, he seemed relaxed, acknowledging my presence without fear, but also without dependence. In late spring, I noticed Bob wasn't alone anymore. He had a mate, a female bobcat I occasionally saw with him. By summer, I spotted 3 kittens following their mother near my property line. Bob was raising a family in territory that included my land. I was honored and moved by this development. The animal I'd helped during that desperate storm night had survived, thrived, and was now contributing to the next generation of bobcats in these mountains. I watched the family from respectful distance through binoculars. The kittens were playful, tumbling with each other, learning to hunt by pouncing on insects and small prey their parents brought them. Bob was an attentive father, bringing food, teaching his offspring to survive in this challenging environment. The female was protective, always vigilant, ensuring her babies stayed safe. One evening in late August, almost a year after the storm that had brought Bob to my porch, I was sitting outside reading when I saw movement at the edge of my yard. Bob emerged from the forest, alone this time. He stopped about 30 feet from where I sat, close enough that I could see him clearly, far enough that he maintained wild distance. We looked at each other for perhaps a full minute. His golden eyes were calm, assessing, intelligent. I didn't move, barely breathed, not wanting to break the moment. Then Bob did something that made my heart stop. He lowered his front body in what looked unmistakably like a bow, a brief dip of his head and shoulders before turning and disappearing back into the forest. I sat there stunned. Had I really just witnessed what I thought I had? Or was it meaningless Bobcat movement that I'd interpreted through my human need for narrative and meaning? I called Officer Martinez again, described what I'd seen. She laughed gently, not mocking but understanding. She said I would probably never know for certain what Bob's gesture meant, if it meant anything at all. But she reminded me that my initial act of compassion, sheltering an injured animal during a storm, had absolutely saved that Bobcat's life. Everything that followed, his survival, his family, his presence in these mountains, existed because I'd made a choice to help rather than to turn away out of fear or convenience. Whether Bob understood that in any conscious way didn't ultimately matter. What mattered was the choice itself, the decision to extend compassion across the species boundary, to recognize another creature's suffering and respond with kindness rather than indifference. That perspective changed how I thought about my isolated life in these mountains. I'd moved here seeking solitude, escaping from a marriage and a life that felt suffocating. I thought I was retreating from connection, choosing independence over relationship. But my encounter with Bob taught me that connection and independence aren't opposite. You can be self-sufficient and still open to moments of profound relationship. You can maintain boundaries and still offer help when it's genuinely needed. The story of Bob became part of local wildlife lore. Park rangers shared it with visitors as an example of appropriate human-wildlife interaction. Schools invited me to talk to students about respecting and coexisting with the animals we share the land with. I was reluctant to become any kind of spokesperson, but I recognized that the story had value beyond my personal experience. In talks with students, I emphasized several points. First, you should never approach or feed wild animals under normal circumstances. Wild animals need to remain wild to survive. Second, there are rare exceptions, situations where an animal is genuinely in immediate danger, and human intervention might save its life without creating long-term dependence. The key is knowing the difference, and when in doubt, contacting wildlife professionals. Third, animals are more complex, intelligent, and emotionally sophisticated than we often give them credit for. They experience fear, pain, stress, and yes, probably forms of relief and even gratitude when suffering is alleviated. We should approach wildlife with respect for that complexity, recognizing that they're not just biological machines, but conscious beings with their own experiences of the world. Bob's family remained in the area through the following winter and beyond. I watched his kittens grow into young adults, eventually dispersing to establish their own territory. Bob and his mate continued to raise new litters each year. My property became known among local wildlife biologists as part of a stable Bobcat territory, evidence that these predators could coexist successfully with thoughtful human neighbors. I continued my quiet life in the mountains, working remotely, hiking with Max, reading by the fire on winter nights, but I was no longer running from connection. I'd learned that isolation and relationship weren't mutually exclusive, that you could live independently while still remaining open to moments of profound encounter. Every time I saw a bobcat on my property, whether it was Bob or one of his offspring or a completely different animal, I remembered that stormy October night when a desperate young predator sought shelter on my porch. I remembered the choice I'd made to help rather than to turn away, and I remembered the rabbit he'd brought the next day, an offering that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild, a gesture that meant something, even if we'll never fully understand what.